All right. Hi everybody. I am Jake Schwartz. I am founder CEO of General Assembly. This is not my corporate presentation. I was asked to sort of give some thoughts, and so that's what this is. So you'll sort of see, and my fonts are totally off here, so you just have to trust that we're more on brand usually than this, but it's fine. It actually works with my thing. So for those of you who don't know, General Assembly began really as a grad school replacement, trying to bring trade school to the Ivy Leagues, was sort of the way I used to facetiously talk about it. We built 17 campuses around the world where we train people in the most in-demand skills of the 21st century, which sort of over time has now been called the boot camp industry. I would argue pretty strenuously that it's much, much, much more than that if it's done properly. So a couple just things that I think are very interesting to keep in mind about General Assembly. So beyond our 17 campuses, we work with hundreds of employers. We have thousands of employers who hire our grads. And through that experience, I've sort of developed some thoughts, opinions about where the world of education to employment is going. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about to all of you today. A few stats on GA very quickly that people usually don't know. One is that almost 50% of our revenue comes from employer pay as opposed to consumer pay models. And I'm going to argue, and this talk will be all about who pays is the most important question in this part of higher education. And sometimes gets eclipsed by conversations about learning methodologies or technologies. Those are all enabling factors, but who pays to me is really where the story begins and ends. We believe that in 3 years, we will probably be more like 80% employer pay. And I believe this is a long-term sustainable and positive evolution for the way we think about the types of higher education that lead or are meant to lead to employment. The next thing is that we don't just do coding. We do UX design, which is almost as big as coding, and that's relatively a small category in the scheme of things. Data, which we began almost 4.5 years ago, but have gotten pretty serious about in the last 1.5 years, is growing rapidly, and we also teach a lot of other relevant subjects sort of in this world of digital transformation. So digital marketing, product management, visual design. We are always trying to look for what is the next in-demand skill, the thing that employers are in pain about hiring for, and try to build meaningful programs that transform people's lives around that. The other important thing is people think of us as always offline. We very much believe in the offline model. We believe that there's not a lot of replacement for it in terms of getting to the meaningful outcomes that we all want to believe are possible for transforming our workforce. But online and software in general is very, very useful in that context. And so even today, we are about 30% online in our delivery. I believe by the end of this year, we will be talking more about 50% online delivery. I think that gets to about the right mix. And all of these things are setting the stage for a little bit of a rant that I'm about to go on. My next warning is that these are ugly CEO slides. And that was even before I realized that they don't have my fonts on that computer. But these are going to be ugly. Hopefully it's inversely proportioned to the brilliant insights that I have created on the slides to come. So my goal here is to recruit you as allies here in rethinking a couple different things. One is to ask, answers to these questions. How do we sustainably bridge the skills gap? Two, how do we meaningfully increase diversity in our talent pipelines? Three, how do we actually save money for all our companies and the companies of our world? Because that is going to be part of what it means to make it sustainable. And four, how do we think in general about education to employment? And what does employment mean? What does education mean? And how do those things start to commingle, as we've already seen year in and year out? Now, I like to show this when I'm talking to companies, this slide, because it helps sort of frame the global issue. What I'm using some of these headlines to show now is that these are the same headlines I could have shown in 2011 when I first attended this conference. There are more headlines because the story has become a bit of a zeitgeist, but they haven't meaningfully changed. And what you will see sort of interspersed among these headlines over time is stories of people trying to do small, anecdotal, really heartwarming stories about how people are trying to solve this in little ways. And yet the problem is still here, and it's still bigger than ever. And I think we all know that. We hear it constantly. It's certainly a theme at this conference. We hear it from all our corporate partners. And yet not only the headlines are there, they're getting louder and more extreme. And this, to me, is a big part of the paradox that I wonder, what does this mean? It means we're not really solving it. And that could be a matter of time or scale, or I might suggest also approach. The other thing I'm going to say is that there are more, at this conference, and a lot of them are friends of mine, more online catalogs selling to enterprises than ever before. Almost all of the companies on this list have pivoted or are going to pivot to an enterprise-focused strategy, selling to companies the story of workforce development and training and workforce transformation. I think when we started in 2011, there were maybe one or two of these that existed. Even fewer had the strategies that they have today. This is a really interesting thing in retrospect to the last slide, right? If I can go there. So more than ever, these guys are bigger than ever. They are some of the darlings of this conference. So what's going on? I believe that one of the reasons those businesses continue to get funded, continue to have success, continue to get customers among the enterprise set is what I call the perpetual dream of zero marginal cost. A lot of the hopes and dreams of most of the companies in this space, in the ed tech world, at this conference year in and year out, are about this fantasy, and I'm going to call it a fantasy, about zero marginal cost. It makes a lot of sense from a business perspective. If you can make something once and sell it 1,000 times, that's way better than having to deliver services again and again and again and again. That's how you make a lot of money. And they are all pretty good products. I mean, there's a range of quality, but they're all pretty good, and they do have a valuable value proposition, I think, to a lot of individuals and a lot of organizations. But my biggest argument, and the title of this talk, is you get what you pay for. And this is really relevant when you think about the things that we have learned and butted against for years in the 7 years that we've been building GA. One is that engagement matters. And I mean it in all those terms. How actively is the student engaged? How motivated are they? How frequently are they engaged? What is the type of engagement? These are all the things that drive successful outcomes. Two is that the social and mentorship experience that we think of when we talk about a typical classroom is not just hype, it's not just fuzzy, it does create better outcomes. I can give you hypotheses on why, and there are people who do data and studies on this. I think it comes down to a sense of being in a boat with a bunch of other people, going down the same thing, rowing in the same direction, competing with one another, learning from one another. It is not insignificant. Three, and actually really important, something we had to focus a lot in our early days, is the emotional journey of transformation when adults start learning. And these are mostly, I want to be clear, college-educated adults that we deal with here. This is not people who are really people who have had terrible education experiences or struggles in the past. But the emotional journey of trying to learn something new, something hard, once you've reached that age of maturity where you kind of have been out of the context of being vulnerable, of not understanding something, of struggling, is not only significant, it's probably one of the most important determiners of success in most of our programs. When you hit the trough, which usually happens around week 6 to 8, are you going to stick through it, or are you going to throw in the towel? And how much are you going to freak out when you don't get something? And how resourceful are you going to be in pushing through that barrier? Obviously, in a zero marginal cost environment, it is very much harder to guide people through that emotional process. And I think finally, and we've learned this in many ways, it is very hard to get people to a true employment outcome level of skills transformation on a zero marginal cost, asynchronous online model. There are ways you can do it. We do some live online versions of our immersive transformational programs. They work. They typically work because they're not much cheaper to run than our classroom-based models. There are benefits, and you save costs in some places. I think because we're so focused on the outcome, we tend to take those costs we save and put them other places. That's not to say there aren't margin opportunities using software for the investors in the audience. I want you to think that we're like a Luddite model that will never scale. But like in general, outcomes, which is what people are paying for, what companies will eventually, I think, meaningfully be paying for, are all about those outcomes, and zero marginal cost is very, very difficult strategy to try and make that happen. Okay, so these catalogs I'm talking about are amazing, like, sort of inventions of our age, right? These are the libraries. You know, you think about when Andrew Carnegie, as part of his philanthropic mission, sort of built public libraries all across the country. What an amazingly valuable sort of piece of social infrastructure that was. And I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember going to the library as a kid and thinking of it as part of my learning experience. And these online libraries are fantastic. But they are still just libraries. And to some extent, I usually like to say that, like, you know, if all it took was having a method of remote learning and a self-paced on a long tail of subject matters, that invention actually happened with Gutenberg 500 years ago. And it did not displace the need for other types of learning services along the way. And I feel the same way about this. I also think for companies, and that's really the sort of my focus of this, the real value creation for companies in this context is developing actual new talent, building the pipeline, thinking about new ways of taking what is probably one of your biggest P&L items, one of your biggest investments, the thing of which a lot of your success hinges, and making it better, using training as a tool. And a tool not for its own sake, not for learning because it makes us feel good and we can talk about it on, you know, on all hands meetings days, but instead using it to accomplish real business outcomes. Am I frozen? Okay. So my next step here is why is this happening? Why do we keep hitting on the head? Why do companies sort of eagerly soak up these catalog ideas, these businesses, and yet are still struggling with the same problems and struggle with it the same way? A big part of it, I believe, is that the training budgets of companies, as they've been traditionally known and traditionally sort of set up, are typically, and these are in like progressive companies, around $1,000 to $2,000 per employee, a max. And at best, that sort of represents around $200 a month. So it's not an accident when you look at these catalogs that they tend to be priced either at or below that number. Meanwhile, the true talent engine, the engine that is really where companies are making their meaningful investments, solving their problems, patching holes, you know, really deploying real capital, is not in training. It's in their recruiting budgets, where, especially in the sectors where we participate, recruiting budgets are often $20,000 to $30,000 per hire, if not more. And churn costs even more because of the replacement and the delay cost. That is an order of magnitude higher. And that is where the real opportunity sits for transforming how companies manage learning, talent development, and everything in between. Recruiting, however, which is where all this money goes, is really a zero-sum game. Company A, I mean, especially in tech, I want to be very clear. Company A will poach from Company B, if there's any Silicon Valley people here. Oh, Hillary is right there, right? Yeah, so like, this is how it works, right? This is how LinkedIn, they poach from Pinterest, Pinterest poaches from Google, Google poaches from LinkedIn, and around we go. And who benefits from that? Well, number one is recruiters. Recruiters, if you look at the market, there are 5, 6, 7, 8 recruiting and staffing firms that have market caps larger than the largest education companies on the planet right now. And two, the talent that figures out a way to cash in on these bidding wars and the rising wages also benefit incredibly well. Both of these things become real challenges for companies trying to scale their workforce and go through digital transformations. This is crucial. Because what we're hearing again and again and again is companies are struggling to meet their 2020 hiring plans. They're seeing massive amounts of spend either needing to be deployed or delays happening, and they're not exactly sure what to do about it. The policies that are currently sort of in vogue in our government are not making it any better. So here's my thing. Learning is either talent acquisition or talent retention. The alternative to spending a lot of money on talent acquisition is spending on retention and growth of your existing employee base, okay? The alternative to spending a lot on retention and growth of your existing employee base is spending innovatively on talent acquisition. These things work in tandem with one another to solve the same problem, which is you need the right people in the right seats doing the right things so that you can do the things you need to do to continue to be a successful business. Both of these activities, however, are worth far more than $1,000 a year. It's worth way more than giving somebody an access to a catalog, of which, by the way, the engagement rates, if they're in the single digits and they're in the high single digits, that's a success, sort of implies. And so the question is, where is this disconnect coming? What's going on? And I don't have an answer yet. That is the sort of the thing I want to leave you with today. What I will say is, in this world, 2017, with everything going on all different sides, and it could just be that we've been talking about it for long enough, it could be that the pain is getting more extreme, we have now started to see a shift among companies. And it used to be 10 companies, and now it's probably more like 50 companies that have started to think differently, started to be open to new ideas, to starting to deploy those massive budgets on recruiting in new and interesting ways that allow for really exciting, innovative ways of thinking about training, getting people on-ramp into the company, getting them reskilled once they're in the company. Why is this happening? Well, I think I have a bunch of hypotheses, and some of them I can tell you over beers, but the ones I can say publicly is that I think corporations are way behind their 2020 digital transformation hiring plans. And digital transformation is not just like a little hypey thing. It can be used as a hypey thing, but literally almost every industry on the planet is this crisis, and the answer of almost every CEO is we're going to be a software company by 2020. And that involves a massive increase in hiring, a shift of what roles you have inside your company, and that is a huge undertaking from a human resources perspective. The second is, to the extent that you want to enlarge in your talent pool, and part of enlarging it is definitely going to be making it more diverse. This is going to be the thing that drives diversity. You're not going to do it with the same recruiting tactics that you were doing 30 years ago. And the problem is most companies are doing, with the exception of maybe paying LinkedIn instead of, but they also still pay all the recruiters and staffers. There is not a lot that's different about the way companies hire and think about development and training than there was 30 years ago at a fundamental level. The other thing is that they're starting to realize, as is our sort of constant pitch to them, that training in a meaningful, transformative way, as we've sort of gotten to do at scale and learn how to do at scale, is much cheaper, much better for everyone than firing and rehiring. It's the solution to the zero-sum game. This is just the beginning for us in terms of thinking about this, and I'm really here just to pose a bunch of questions and thoughts and a dilemma and to say, how else can we do this? This is how we can transform the talent ecosystem. This is how we can transform the education to employment pipeline and make it much more productive as a society and unlock resources to put towards other things. And so, I might challenge everyone in the room, especially those who sit on top of training and development budgets or are thinking about learning for their organization. How could we think differently? And we want to help you do that in any way that makes sense. We have some ideas, and we'd love to talk to you about them. I had another slide. Oh, crap. All right. Well, we'll look at this great screensaver while I say a few last things. The key thing is that, I have probably now had hundreds of conversations with learning and development officers, with heads of HR. The most shocking thing, and these are the biggest, most sophisticated companies, is how few understand their true costs of recruiting, their true costs of retention, their costs of not filling a seat when they have a big growth and transformation plan. And this, to me, is the enemy of solving a lot of these problems. In the context where they do not understand it, $1,000 a year makes sense. It's kind of like a small little benefit for the employee. What our goal is, and where I think this can really start to transform the world, create new opportunities for people so they don't end up in debt, so companies can end up more productive, so everybody can live in a greater harmony as employers or management or capital, is a world in which we unlock those resources in a way that's much more meaningful. That is my talk. I think I can do Q&A. So if anyone wants to start to have a debate, let's do it now. It's fun. I have lights, so I can't really see anybody, but it looks like people were listening. Yes?
Question for you. I know you guys are really well known for training people up, getting them, you guys are really well known for training people up and getting them ready for digital transformation jobs. Mm-hmm. Tell us, and maybe I'm behind the curve, how is it going with your discussions with people in CLO roles now to transform their workforces? How far are you along in that? That's what I'm trying to get a feel for.
Yeah, so I would say we've been working at it for years, and I think we've over time been able to invest. I mean, we've been working with big companies since almost our start. So you start to have a 7-year track record. We've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world. You can get some credibility. The real conversation around, and what I'm finding is, for the longest time, CLOs, and I want to say this in the nicest possible way, because I love them, but they were the enemy. And they were the enemy because, and it wasn't their fault, but they are not empowered with solving real business problems. They do not understand the costs, the P&Ls that are associated with these other parts of the talent ecosystem. And so typically what would happen is they have a cap on their budget. Their charge is scale. This is why the catalogs make it's such a great sale. It's a perfect business because they have to check the box of saying, does everybody have access to something that then we can go talk about? I want as much scale as possible for as cheap a price as possible. And so a lot of what we do now is a teaching process, an education process with those teams of connecting them with the business side, of helping them, pushing them to understand their goals. Because I'll tell you, we've done big, $1 million engagements with companies around learning and development around certain things, where the engagement didn't fail, but was not nearly as successful as we think it actually was or considered as successful, because there were no business outcomes defined up front. And I think this is sort of a key theme, I will say, is that it's not about learning for learning's sake. It is about accomplishing business outcomes. And the question is, how do we use that fuel, that real motivation corporations have to have business outcomes, to drive the right training, to have the right people, and to create the most frictionless environment there possible.
So GA has a pretty strong culture and strong values, and I'm wondering how are you thinking about supplementing these kind of discrete skills training with maybe a cultural transformation in addition to digital transformation?
Yeah, that's a great question. First off, I think the cultural transformation comes first because a company needs to be somewhat enlightened even to want to invest this way in their talent. So I'll tell you, like when we see, the size of deals we're doing now is pretty mind-blowing. That comes with a cultural shift of saying, this is important to us. Some of these engagements are things like taking hundreds of employees who are going to be obsolete within the next 3 years and saying, we want to keep them as part of our organization. They have contextual knowledge and they've been loyal to us. We need to figure out a way to be loyal to them. And that turns into a radical reskilling project. And that involves everything from light online stuff to intensive in-person 12-week full-time programs. But it's at a scale that I'm going to argue you can't even start on that deal. You can't deploy those resources until you've had that real cultural transformation, and at least at the top level. I also think that there is a reciprocal environment. This can help culture, right? Because when you start to build a spirit of we are actually investing, really investing in our people, not giving them subscriptions, investing in them, it changes the dialogue between employer and employee in really meaningful ways. And I think that when you talk about cultural change is one of the most important things inside our companies. Anything else? Oh, one more.
Are you working with other parts of the organization?
So what I would say is business. What I would say is when the owners of the business are always our best conversations, always. And it might just be how we're oriented, is we're a solutions-oriented outcomes company. We always have been. Is that they understand their needs. They understand what outcomes they require. They want to talk about outcomes. They don't want to talk about learning. And that sort of has become a big mantra.
Hey, thanks,
Sorry,
Jake.
Amy.
So solving the skills gap is sort of how I think about my work and sort of why I do the work that I do. And I know that you're aligned with that. Could you maybe talk about sort of the rising activism from consumers, from learners, from corporations, from government, from candidates, and sort of how they're viewing their own career trajectory or sort of their own lifelong learning, and then the decisions they're making around sort of employability and where they want to sort of, what they want to do for their next chapter or their next phase of their life or career?
So I could write a book on that, but I will try to sort of address that the way I will choose to address it, because I'm on stage. What I would say is, I believe this career path concept is sort of used as a buzzword, but is actually quite important when you think about what millennials want, but really what anybody wants, and what keeps them retained and keeps them engaged in their company. And so learning can be, that is the talent retention growth path. Nobody wants to sit and do the same thing every day. At least millennials don't. And they certainly don't want to think they're going to be doing the same thing 5 years from now. This kind of radical reskilling, these sort of moments of investment that they see from a company earn an incredible amount of goodwill, trust, loyalty, et cetera. I also think you have to build the guideposts of where you can go and what is available. And we're doing a lot of work. So we have an entire assessment platform. We are building meaningfully deep credentials around our core subject matters. And to me, those things, not badges, but like really meaningful things that say you're at a level 1 of this subject, you could get to level 5 and make a lot more money. And then talk about that and then make commitments around, if you get there, we will have a conversation about your promotion. Those are the kind of meaningful career paths that people want to hear and see. And by the way, you can do this. This is not just about advanced tech skills. I think middle skills especially. There are so many opportunities to build career paths that would meaningfully change the employee churn retention dynamics of where in industries where frankly those are the big costs. And so there is a big opportunity. I know Amy had a question, but Amy, why don't you? Oh, sorry, I pointed the wrong direction at the same. I was talking to you. There we go. Increase our diversity of our questioner.
As you answer the question about who pays and you move
Yes.
toward the enterprise level sell and continue to do so, is there a counter dynamic around the demand for greater personalization of what's actually delivered to the individual learner?
So this is where I become a bit of a contrarian, and I think personalization has its point. But here's let's make personalization a lot more specific. Personalization at the end of the day is about not teaching people things that they either already know or aren't ready for, right? And that can be done a lot of ways. And you can create a very fancy algorithm that pulls from a whole host of content to build some magically customized thing. I think that might be overkill a lot of the times. And I think what we see is actually the craving of some standards, of clarity, of visibility. And personalization is another way of saying, who knows what this means? And the meaning, the signifiers here are the most important dynamic of the learning. One more, I think we are probably way out of time.
Thank you, Jake. Lucian Tarnowski. I loved your point about access to libraries, and that began with Guggenheim. I like to say that MOOCs are the animal farm of education, this Orwellian model.
There's probably some MOOCs in this room, so we can be a little bit nicer to MOOCs.
But the question here is, the real shift in my eyes is this ability for people to participate in their learning and become truly involved and become teachers as well as learners. So what role does peer-to-peer learning and empowering the whole ecosystem, empowering the community play in your eyes here?
Well, a few ways. One is that I would say, as I talked about, this social experience of a cohort is very, very valuable. and does create meaningful outcomes. That is where I believe it. Secondly, in our system, there are people in every cohort who love the experience of being in the classroom and want to give back, and so become teaching assistants or want to do that. That's a big thing too. We have opportunities for mentorship in a lot of different ways on different platforms that we do. That is another way that people can be peer-to-peer. I do think inside the company, the peer-to-peer concept has become a little bit of a zeitgeist as well, and I think like a lot of these, they're great ideas in concept, but then it's like, how do you do them in a way that actually drives meaningful results? And I find that they end up being used somewhat cynically as excuses to not spend as much money on training. And so I'm sort of wary of all these highfalutin concepts, not because I don't think they work, because I'm a big believer in I mean, we look at all of these things and we try to implement them in ways that are really truly scalable and meaningful. But again, when you start using the outcome as the goal, some of the noise falls away, and you start to say, where does this meaningfully drive impact versus where is it hype? All right, I think I'm going to get kicked off the stage here. But thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful. I'm always available to talk more. Thank you.